any wargame, anytime. Hey folks, welcome back to Any Wargame, Anytime. I'm Bozz. I'm joined here today by Dan, Sam, and our special guest Ivan of Nordic Weasel Games. Dan, how you doing today?
I am doing very good. Really glad to have Ivan on and looking forward to another awesome podcast.
Wonderful. How you doing, Sam?
I'm all right, other than the fact my car's been in the shop for the last 2 days, and hopefully I was hoping to get it back today, and I'm probably not going to get it back today. So that's an unfortunate reality of living in a world where we are dependent on machines to do things for us.
Done machines. And Ivan, how are you? And tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm doing great. Excited to sit down and do this with you guys. I guess it all started when I was 0 years old. We'll fast forward a little bit. I'm in mid-40s. I grew up in Denmark. I live in the United States currently. And I have written 1 or 2 games in my time.
And the rest.
There's been a few. But yeah, just kind of one of the few who managed to turn it into a career of sorts. So, that's a bit of an achievement.
It's a great achievement. So
That is, yeah.
What is it that you're interested? Tell us a bit about your war games and what drew you towards those kinds of war games, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know that I set out to be in a specific niche other than stuff that interests me in general. But I sort of ended up being the skirmish campaign guy, I suppose. Partially, I always kind of liked skirmish games because 99% of the war gamers who didn't start with historical games, I started with Games Workshop. So that kind of, got me onto the path that if it is not one figure equals one man, then it's cheating a little bit. And that's, that ends up being kind of hard to shake. So I always kind of stuck with that, but I always thought that format could be more than it was at the time. So when I started writing, professionally or commercially, whatever you want to call it, it is hard to believe that there was a time when skirmish games were not 100 new games coming out every week.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a time in those heady days. So it felt like there was a bit of a niche to kind of occupy. And I had always been one to be really fascinated with the idea of campaign rules in games. That was kind of the other, niche I really geared into. It was always this thing that it would show up occasionally in, maybe more so in skirmish sci-fi games than in historical games, where it was always hidden away in the back. So there would be a little table you could roll on to see if your one guy died or something. I always thought that was really cool, and I wanted more of it. But until 2-hour war games kind of popped up and really started doing that, it wasn't much of a thing. So that was kind of my main fascinations that led me down the path where I'm at now with stuff I develop professionally. And some of it is just reflection of what I'm interested in normally. I'm interested in science fiction stuff, so I've done a lot of sci-fi games. I'm generally interested in 20th century warfare, things like that.
So something that's kind of prevalent among your games is the fact that they're either solo friendly or they're designed specifically to be played solo. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of why solo wargaming and why you kind of went in that direction?
Yeah, it's 2 parts really. One is that around the same time that campaign gaming was kind of starting to become a thing, you guys probably all remember 10 years ago or so, it was kind of unusual to have solo mechanics in games at all. There were some, and there's always been stuff like that out there, but it was not really a thing that was specifically catered to or specifically had stuff made for it. It was kind of a joke, look at the sad loser who doesn't have a group to game with, he can play solo. And again, I think 2-hour war games was one of the first who kind of on a commercial stage showed that no, it's fine. This can be a legitimate way of playing. And the funny thing is that I never played I've always played games solo on and off, but never as my like primary thing. But it just became really fascinating to like develop for. And once I started working on it, originally it was, I'll be honest, it was mostly because I'd seen other people do it and I thought it was neat, so I wanted to try. But one of the things that happened was I would start getting messages from people, like emails, or because I was putting my email address in the books. And, you get all sorts of stuff. But the ones that stood out to me were people who were like, yeah, like I moved to a different town. I don't really have a group to play with. I live in, some podunk village somewhere in the United States. And there's nobody here who plays war games at all. But now I can sit down and play this game, stuff like that. Or like people who are talking about like, well, my group plays like one thing. Like it's probably Warhammer.
It probably is.
But I want to play something different. And now I can like get that like on the side without having to talk the dudes at the store or the club into buying like a new army for something. And that was really like meaningful to see like, oh, here's in a way like these people who kind of had just been like passed by, or they didn't really have anything that like catered to that. And it's very different now because, solo and campaign and work band type of games have become really common in the last few years. It seems like every week there's a new one popping up on Kickstarter, and it advertises you can play it like same side or solo, or that's an option. So I don't know that like I necessarily pioneered anything, because I don't think I did, but it was kind of part of like getting the needle moving on that, making it become like an accepted thing.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember solo wargaming used to be sort of like it's almost like a lot more people did it than they admitted, because you're right, had a bit of a stigma. Because I would solo war game some different games throughout my life. Like I said, like either I would do it especially for like tournament play. So if I'm like prepping for a tournament, I would basically proxy an army and play that. But I also from that just started to find that I do enjoy solo gaming. But you're right, I never admitted it for a long time, because there was sort of that, oh, why don't you don't have a gaming group? Well, you're right, maybe I didn't want to play 40K or the latest thing out there. So yeah, I think that's I think that it's, to me, it's good that solo wargaming is kind of becoming a lot more maybe acceptable, I guess, and maybe the fandom, I guess, within us. Would you characterize that as kind of accurate? That
yeah, I think so. I think it also the revelation that maybe everyone kind of had was that solo gaming is not only an alternative to gaming with your friend or gaming at the club or something. It can also be something you do for like different reasons than like I've talked to a lot of people who talk about they will have a game that they're just kind of like puttering around with in the evening or something. So they have that set up and they play it solo, and it's not really the same experience thereafter as when they're playing a game with their friend or a game at the club or at the store. Maybe it's something that is like a unique interest to them, or they wanted to, or they just like to like mess with it. It's a way to kind of like have a little bit of gaming. You can just kind of leave set up. Like I do this with like Hex and Counter war games a lot. I'll just have it set up and I'll play like a turn every night or something. Yeah. And it just becomes this, like it's a way of like getting a little injection of gaming on your own terms, and for something that doesn't have to be. You can do like a dumb scenario that wouldn't work normally, or you can try out like
something totally unbalanced or something just for the hell of it.
Yeah, see what happens if I take one squad of these guys and they have to hold on as long as possible, or like you can do anything you want, because the only thing, like, you're just playing to see what happens. And I think that's quite common, is because it kind of lets you like not be invested in a specific army. You can, but you like when I do it myself, I'm often just kind of seeing what comes out of it. Like I'm not specifically quote playing either side, and that's a different way. So yeah, I think the understanding that solo can be many more things than just a replacement for a head-to-head like War Machine or 40K type game, I think has been really important.
Well, I got into solo wargaming like back in 2016. I was very transient at the time, and it was of necessity. I found There was a cool creator called Angel Barracks. He put out a game called
Mm.
AR-15, and I actually
Yeah.
went to his house to pick up the starter set because I didn't have an address to post it out to. So he was a 6 mil wargaming guy, and he'd written his own rules for his 6 mil figures. And 6 mil was perfect for me at the time because I was living in a tiny space. And immediately after that, I found 5 core, which was just a really great system for playing solo. And that was, the first 5 parsecs was the 5 core system, and that was my first kind of solo campaign. And it was, me squeezed in the back of my van playing on a tiny little table that was, a foot by a foot and just working perfectly. And it was just, I really got into it stopped being something that I was doing because I didn't have another choice. It started being something that I was doing because I was enjoying the experience of playing it by myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see, like, especially you do connect your solo game, but also because I know that runs hand in hand for me with my solo play is a story. It's that sort of, it's not just playing a game one-off, but you actually get to sort of create your own story as well. I know that goes on, in some of your games where you have this, you even call it like RPG light-esque, where it's really your games, and we see it's becoming more popular. It's sort of, games are starting to bleed almost into RPGs, and almost sort of like a computer RPG, but just a lot less bound by just this, the code of a computer game. Do you kind of see that the case where these, war games and RPGs are sort of blending together? Yeah.
Yeah. There's kind of a gray space between the two that I always found like really interesting. And it was one of those, when I was growing up, the people that I sort of established, like I think a lot of people you have whatever game you first get exposed to, and you might play a little bit, and maybe you don't really understand it, or you're not really playing it because you're kind of too young and too inexperienced. And then eventually you find like a group that you learn to play for real with. And that's kind of like your proper, like, coming of age as a gamer. I think that's probably pretty common. And with that crowd, there was always just this vibe that we were just into games. So we would play role-playing games. We would play miniatures games. We would play cards. We even LARPed once, poorly, but we did. Like, if it was a game we wanted to play, there wasn't a hard distinction between different types of games. And we would do in that way that, like, young people who don't know better yet or don't know why they shouldn't do it yet will just mush things together. So we would come up with stuff and have, like, we would play like a miniatures battle, and then that would affect like an RPG campaign we were doing. And it wasn't real formal. It was just kind of like naturally flowing. And when I got older, I was always like confused or surprised because I would talk to people and they only played RPGs and they didn't do cards, they didn't do miniatures. Or I would talk to people who just play Warhammer and they don't play RPGs, and it was always weird to me. And I've made my peace with it. There's a lot of times you're not interested in everything, or you don't have time for everything. But that space between role-playing games and miniatures games always was really interesting to me, because a lot of times it always felt to me like the space was kind of arbitrary and sort of like erected to keep these things apart. Like, we all know, like, Dungeons and Dragons originated out of like chainmail. Like, everyone's read that story. But I think, like, very quickly both sides sort of like sketched out those lines to like separate ourselves. So like war games went this one direction where it all has to be either very like military and simulation-y, or it has to be very like points driven and tournament based. That's kind of like the two main roads. And the RPG folks zoomed off to do all the big narrative stuff and tell stories and, do all that. And I always felt like a pity, because I think I've always had that feeling when you're playing a miniatures game that they can inherently, even before you add anything to it, they can generate very powerful stories. Like, if you ask anybody who's played miniatures games, they will have a story of something that happened in a game. Like, their sergeant threw a grenade and it happened to like do something terrible, or this one squad that survived everything that were thrown at them, or the one like heavy weapon unit that couldn't hit anything the whole game. And that story happened 10 years ago, and they're still telling it today. We've all like been at the gaming store when somebody is like telling that story from Gen Con of 1989. which is proof to me that miniatures games can generate stories just from the drama and the randomness that happens. So taking that and bringing in some of the RPG aspects is something that I just found like really interesting, because there were a lot of games that kind of hinted at that and started offering a little bit of that. Like you'll see people talk about like Laser Burn, the old game, or like Inquisitor, which often gets held up as like a half RPG. And those all had elements of that, but they didn't really like push into the story aspect of things. So it was always like lurking out there, and I think it just needed like a little bit of a push to like, how do you like make story happen, in a game?
And I think that segues very nicely into a bit of a discussion around 5 parsecs and kind of the five series in general, 5 leagues, and the black powder one whose name escapes me. this current juncture. Thank you. But yeah, it was really 5 parsecs from home that was the first one that I came across anyway, in the setting that I wanted. That was a full narrative campaign wargame system. And you've been working on that for a long time now. You're in your 3rd edition. So do you want to kind of tell us a bit about how that started and kind of the building of it and kind of where it is today?
Yeah. So as you know, since you started with the original Blue Book, so the whole thing really starts with 5 Men in Normandy, which is sort of the genesis point of a lot of this, which was basically, at the time, I had decided to quit my job and I was going to write games, and we're going to see what happened. And at the time, I played a lot of World War II stuff, so it was pretty self-evident that the first thing I did would be a World War II game. So I put something together. As it happens a lot, it all started with like sketching out some mechanics on a piece of paper and then kind of folding in like, okay, this is going this way. This is obviously a World War II skirmish game. And starting to experiment with some of those ideas of having like personality traits for the characters. And some of them had a mechanical effect, some did not. Having random event tables that happen after battles and kind of figuring out like, how do you make those interesting? More so than just the generic like RPG style random event tables that you get. 5 Core itself was basically taking the core of the World War II game and just slimming it down as a standalone thing. It was one of those things that somebody had asked for, and I put it together, and then it ended up being more popular than the parent game. I'll be honest, I don't actually remember what was the specific impetus for 5 Parsecs in itself. It just kind of happened. I know I was heavily influenced, like Necromunda and stuff like that. That's kind of that looms large over any like miniatures campaign game, I think. But it was one of those things. Once I started like putting pen to paper or grubby fingers to keyboard, it started taking shape real fast, because I started getting this idea of like kind of having that sort of loose, open-ended setting surrounding it. That I had always found interesting in games, especially growing up. And then building it into all the campaign stuff and the different things that 5 Core could do with more character-driven things and characters gaining skills. The real stumbling point was that, one, it was 2 separate books. The 5 Core booklet was not very long, like 20 pages maybe. And that was with everything in it. And the 5 Parsec booklet was a huge chunk with a bunch of random tables and stuff. And it was a little unwieldy because you had to kind of flip back and forth between the two. And there was a lot of stuff in there, it's one of those like manic first effort things where like everything just goes on the page. It doesn't matter what it is. If you think of it, it goes in. We'll figure it out later. So at some point I realized that in order for this to really like reach its potential and like be less difficult and perhaps alienating than it could be, because 5 Core as a system also it was one of those games that people could bounce off of. Like everything, like the activations, the combat was all kind of weird. So I said, okay, I'm going to slim a lot of this back down to kind of the basics, the core of what the experience really is about, which is fighting dudes and gaining experience and having things happen. That's kind of like the 3 pillars to the game. trim the rules back down to be very, very simple. One of the advantages I had by then was that I had been able to just see and talk to and hear from people who played solo games and kind of what they ran into. And it gave me the realization that I think solo games often have to be a little simpler than the same game if you're playing it with another person. Because you have one person who is in charge of tracking everything. So you have to understand all the movement rules, because if you screw up how running works, the other guy can't remind you. You have to track all the combat rules. If there are status effects, you have to track all of those. And it compounds really quickly. And in a normal game, the other player can remind you because you just did something with your unit you shouldn't have been able to. They will let you know. But you don't have that solo. And it was something that always irritated me. If I realize that I'm like 3 turns into something and I messed up something big 2 turns ago, it often makes me want to just not complete the game. Like, I get kind of particular about that. So everything had to be cut back a lot. And when people ask with the current 5 parsecs why there's not a lot of like tactical crunch to it, that's really the reason why. That it had to be, the goal was it had to be manageable completely by a single person without really getting lost in the rules. It had to be completely out of the book, meaning that if you don't want to invent anything, you should be able to sit down, go through, the sections page by page, roll on each table in turn. And at the end of it, you have a scenario that you can play that you didn't have to make anything for. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You then sit down and play. The book will tell you how everyone moves and fights and stuff. And then at the end of it, again, you kind of just follow through the process. And at the end of it, you have played a game. But unlike some other games, like my own Starport Scum rules or like Inquisitor, Laser Burn, or some of those, I wanted it to be that you could come up with things if you want to game master it, if you want to make your own scenario, and you do cool stuff, but you didn't have to do it. And that was kind of and that was perhaps a little unprecedented at the time, I think, because there was a tendency to say that scenario-driven games and narrative games assumed a game master. But again, like if the proposition was that this would be a game for a single person to be able to sit and play, it had to function without a game master at all. So that was kind of the key, like, markers. Cut it down, make it stand alone, and make it work out of the box with no extra work. So the original, what became the second edition, which had its own game engine that is similar to the current one now, and it wasn't a very long, I don't have the PDF anymore, but it was a very short booklet.
It was about 40 or 50 pages.
Yeah, it was really like cut to the bone. That was like the least, in hindsight, it was just one of those things that kind of came out, because I think at the time I was also on a bit of a minimalist trip. But it was like the least amount of game that would still like get people's attention. And then after that, you realize, okay, it would be more fun if this thing was in the game, or it would be more fun to have more enemies. So it built back out from there. But that was kind of like throwing out all the cruft and just putting together like, what is the absolute core of this game experience, and then building from that, which is one of those things you can only kind of do once you've like messed it up once and you go back to it, because now you have the bloody nose to tell you what you did wrong or what didn't work for as many people as it could. I think sometimes with wargaming, there's this tendency to like, we're all kind of skeptical of things that are like, quote, dumbed down for like children and stupids or for the masses or whatever. But, like sometimes you do have to accommodate that a little bit, because a game that 3 people in the world likes is not worth as much as a game that, 1,000 people enjoy. So you have to strike that balance, right, of appeal to a wider range while still making it recognizably like something you put, effort and soul into.
Yeah, absolutely.
You really, for wargaming too, if you're not a game that can be played by 15-year-olds, I mean, that's a lot of us when we kind of started down this path was when we were teenagers. And if you have a game that's too complicated for teenagers, like you're really not. It's you're really kind of missing the a big demographic of people who, that we would like to get more of into wargaming in general.
No, absolutely. And I think complexity in games is one of those things that's really, I'm going to go on a tangent here, but it's one of those things that's really difficult to attack because different things will be complex to different people. So like when we talk about like complex war games, a lot of times, everyone has played like, especially like old 80s games, and you have long list of modifiers and sub conditions and things like that. And that's complex to most people. But there's also a different kind of complexity where if a game has a very large amount of choices at any given time, for example, that doesn't look complex on the page if there is, say, 10 different actions my squad can take. But a lot of players will find that complex. They'll find it difficult to deal with because we're kind of wired that if there are that many options, there must be like one or two that are like the good ones. So you can end up with basically like choice paralysis or analysis paralysis, where it is, and I played with a lot of people who are like that, where they would do better with a game that had more crunch to it if the options were fairly few and straightforward. Whereas a simpler game that had a lot of, you see this a lot with games that are using like cards and stuff like that, where there's a array of different choices and options you can make. And it is often difficult to sort of see through like where these options take you.
Or more importantly, see what your opponent can do. Because you're right, once it gets too complex, people don't think more, they think less. It turns into a gotchas, right?
Yeah, I think you can see that a lot with, if you look at like tactics articles for like Warhammer 40K, they are almost all army building focused. And people will often like make fun of that, like, well, there's no tactics in Warhammer. Like, well, that's not quite true, although that could be more. But it's that's the one part that you can like sit down and control and understand, because you can put together how these pieces of the machine works. But you can't, once you, like, if you look at, and this was a big factor in like the recent edition shift, that it had just become too sprawling. There were, hundreds of different, like, I forget what they were called, the little like abilities you could use each turn. You had to pay points for.
Your stratagems.
Yeah, and the list just kept like getting bigger and bigger, and there's no person who can keep track of all that. So, which is a type of complexity that also, it doesn't necessarily look complex, because at the surface of it, you can just say, well, you can just pick like the 3 that are good for your army, but that's not really how it works.
Because you also, when you're playing somebody, you have to, like, if the knowledge base to be able to play competitively becomes too big, you get into scenarios where, a player feels like they lost because they just never encountered this, this special ability that this unit has, and they didn't really know how that works when they sat down, and then they lose and then they feel bad. I mean, that's kind of it's a problem in wargaming, because you want to make things kind of interesting for established players, but when you make things too complex, you end up alienating a lot of new players as well.
I mean, I don't know if it's a complex. Like, I think you brought up a game that's very, to me, apropos is War Machine, where I think rule mechanics wise, War Machine is simple, but the complexity, like when I think of complexity, I oftentimes hear it as more like not complexity in mechanics, but more just the amount of information you need to know. Like because I had friends who played high level War Machine when this is in the heyday 10 years ago. And a lot of what they did was just pure studying, because War Machine mechanically was simple, but every single squad in War Machine did something unique. And you basically had to memorize all that stuff, right? And like, but is that sort of, and is that complexity, or is that just, just memorization, I mean,
that's kind of what I mean by saying that things are complex to different people, because I've played with people who like kind of intuitively take to that. They still have to put in the work to like figure out all the options and how they all like connect with each other. Like that's the reason that you have whole like Discord servers and forums and stuff dedicated to like the meta of Warhammer 40K at any given time, because that is like a full-time job. But that's not necessarily going to be complex to each player type. Does that make sense? Like there's an RPG example, but it's one that's very vivid to me. I played or ran a Rollmaster for a long time, which has a reputation for being, shall we say, not friendly. And I played it with people who were kind of like stoners and burnouts. They were not good with math. They were not good with complex games, but they could play Rollmaster because the choices that were apparent to them were not complex. They could cast a spell, or they could attack with their character, they could try to use a skill. The resolution might be complex, but I could kind of walk them through that. And in the end, it was just roll dice and put numbers together, which you can get through that process. That wasn't the stumbling block for them, whereas a game like War Machine would just have annihilated that group, because there would just be so many moving parts that you have to understand before you're confident that you're not playing it wrong, or you already like lost the game and you don't know yet that you lost it. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's a really terrible feeling when it happens to you too, and turns people off of wargaming, quite honestly, because it doesn't take many times for that experience to hit before it becomes like, okay, I'm just gonna, like, I'm not cut out for this. And that's a terrible thing.
It is. It's a real shame.
Yeah, like there is absolutely a game that you could sit down and play, like, and maybe it's a different topic, or maybe it's a different type of play style,
or maybe it's a solo game that you're not having those moments with somebody else with, so you can go, oh, well, that's complex. Yeah. Maybe I'll just read through the rules one more time, and
right, like let me sit down and just like my play session tonight is just kind of figuring out how does close combat really work. And you can do that without anyone. And then that doesn't preclude you from going and playing with other people as well.
No, that's right.
But
So, kind of on that same topic, tell us a bit about the latest expansion slash supplement to 5 Parsecs, because I know that it includes different options to make parts of the game a little bit crunchier.
Yeah. So one of the things that kind of came out when I got the chance of doing the 3rd edition, it was very open-ended. They were like, obviously they wanted more content than what was there in the previous version, because, you have to kind of justify like the new cool version. But it was kind of left up to me to pick like what was going to go in, what was not. So some of the things like having spaceships with mechanics and stuff, that was new. But I was still kind of holding it back a little bit as far as the complexity. So 2 things kind of happened. The first was there was obviously a lot of people. Whenever you have a set of rules, there's going to be a bunch of people who think it's perfect the way it is. You're going to get people for whom, like, no matter how easy the game is, it is still too involved and they want something to be simpler. And you're going to get the people who can't have enough of like extra stuff. And that's obviously difficult to like satisfy. Right. Like I like kind of heavy, chunky games. I totally get it. I find the process of working through a game very satisfying. But you have to hold those people like back, because otherwise, like the game will just disintegrate around them. So being able to do expansions and being able to say, okay, here's an alternate way of doing this thing, is something that I've always liked doing. Like the original 5 core had a lot of booklets with like alternate rules, like here's a different activation system, well, here's a different way of doing tank combat or something, because I was just like tinkering with it and coming up with stuff, and a lot of times there were more than one way of doing it. So being able to do the expansions and put some of that stuff back out there and say, okay, you guys wanted like a meaner like injury table for after games, well, here is one. This one might not be suitable for the main game because it's too mean, or it's a little too detailed, or whatever the case is. It doesn't matter. But it's still perfectly suitable for a certain type of player. So each of the expansions has kind of been towards that, with the other edition being more kind of scenario types. So the 2 like big things is stealth missions, which is, sort of Commando, Metal Gear, kind of sneak in, blow things up, or mess it up and get blown up. And then a street fight scenario where you're kind of moving around a city street and you have encounters and you can get in gun battles with enemy gangs or agents or whatever. So it's kind of putting in like different ways the game can be played. The salvage missions from the previous expansion are kind of along the same line of these all have like a bunch of subsystems you have to kind of figure out. Not necessarily a lot. Like I think stealth missions are like 6 pages. But there's still a bunch, which means that's a little too much to have as a scenario in the main book, where you're kind of not having to sit down and chew through 6 pages of stealth rules just to play a scenario that comes up once in a while is a big ask, and that's a chunk of pages in the book that could have been used for something that'll come up more often. But putting a stealth scenario in the expansions where it's already kind of assumed, if you're buying the expansion, you're by definition like more invested in the game. Like you're actively wanting more stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of self-selecting for a certain audience. And for that audience, it's perfect. Like you have to read a few more pages, and now you can play the game in a different way, and it'll integrate into how you're already playing your campaign. It just gives you more of that. So that was kind of the thought behind how the expansions kind of fit together. So there's a little bit of a couple of like replacement rules. Like, okay, do you want to, like in the back of the main book, there's like a little snippet about like having factions in the campaign, which is just kind of as inspiration. So now there's a more detailed system for that. There's a new, like I said, the new mission type, stuff like that. But that's kind of the mentality with the expansions. Also to make them so that they are legitimately like stuff you get because it's fun to get, and not stuff because this is the like updated version and you have to buy this expansion to play the proper game. Like you can play 1,000 games of 5 parsecs without having stealth missions. Like nobody was missing it until they learned that it could be a thing. Which I think is important.
And then we had to have it.
Right. Like once it's like the advertising thing. You didn't know how badly you needed like a green iPhone until somebody said you could have one.
Although, I mean, one thing you do well, one thing that I've thought you've always done well, is you listen and respond to the community. 5 Parsecs in particular, and Nordic Weasel Games in general, has a really great online community. I've been a part of it for a long time now, and it's friendly and open with such a small amount of toxicity, and all that stuff's always kind of moved on as soon as it rears its head, and you're always quite present saying, hey, what do you guys think about this? Do you have any ideas? What's your opinion on this? And it's not a surprise to me that this new expansion has stealth rules in it, or that it has faction rules in it, or that it has different combat mechanics in it, because that's something that we as a community have been chatting about amongst ourselves and with you for a good while now.
And that's a great thing. Any wargaming industry people listening to this podcast, please appreciate hear and appreciate
take notes.
Take notes. We don't like being surprised at the end when something comes out, because it just talk to us regularly, and we'll tell you what's wrong, and that's sometimes we're wrong too, but give us the opportunity to be for that.
We would. We would love feedback. So how much, like, how often do you go to your community? Like, in other words, how early do you go to your community with a particular feature or product? Do you wait something's more refined, or do you try to get it in front of them as quick as possible? Or how do you, how do you sort of, because we asked our last game designer here, how do you sort of systematize feedback in your own head? I know you could easily say, oh, I just listen to it, but like almost how do you, because that's, that's easy to say. Yeah.
No, let's get a little more crunchy with it. As far as like when to take something, I think at this point, and I always try to try out different things. So I have tried to put things as a crowdfunding thing. I have tried to put out a free demo version. I've tried to put out like a $1 demo version of things. Sometimes I think just goes to a couple of trusted people. I've kind of felt out and tried like every possible option I can think of, just to see like what happens and how do these things compare. These days, I tend I'm usually a proponent of kind of getting the idea out of my head and into the wild in an early version. Because that kind of rough early version, even if it's not like the best version of what the idea will be, hopefully, people's initial reactions will usually be pretty clear as to whether you're on the right track or not. If people are sort of even if the answer is like, this is kind of a broken mess, but it looks cool, that's useful information to like take back with you. Or if everyone just kind of ignores it, maybe the idea just isn't that fetching yet, or you haven't made it cool yet. It can be a fine idea. So I think getting it out sooner rather than later. That doesn't always happen. There's a few projects that I kind of just mulled over on my own with a few like people that I tend to talk to for kind of raw feedback where they know what I'm looking for and they're not afraid to tell me if it's stupid. But I think there's a tendency, I think, to maybe think our ideas a little too precious. And the secret, or one of the secrets of game writing, is that ideas aren't actually worth anything. Like, nobody is going to Wargame Vault and paying me $19.99 for an idea. They're paying for the execution of that idea.
That's good.
In a way, right. So you have to kind of let the idea, like, throw it in the lake a bit and see if it has anything to it. And I think just getting eyeballs on it sooner rather than later can tend to help that. Actually getting feedback out of that can be pretty difficult. That is, if you talk to anybody, especially somebody who's like starting out, they will say the same thing, that it is so beeping hard to get like feedback on ideas. It is not difficult to get people to say they would give you feedback, but they just got really busy with Minecraft that year, so they couldn't. And that's something you just kind of have to like either work up like a core group of people that you can kind of trust, or you have to get like enough like momentum going, which is difficult, that you can start getting that sort of process. And you have to kind of like, now, like, I forget, there's like 3,000 people or something on the Facebook group for 5 Parsecs. Maybe I'm remembering the number wrong. There's a whole bunch. So now it's pretty easy to throw an idea out and get like 100 comments back on it. But you still have to kind of like dig through and sort of, because a lot of times you'll get people who are responding very earnestly, and that's what you want. Like, is this cool? Is this not cool? But you'll also get people who are just kind of excited that you said something. That doesn't necessarily mean the idea you had was any good. They're just excited that because it looks cool, And you'll get a lot of people who will respond with what they think you wrote or what they wish you were writing about. And you have to kind of be careful with that, because that advice can send you down the wrong path. They're not giving you advice on the actual question you asked. They're giving you advice on a different question they wish you asked. And that's still useful information, just not for what you're currently working on. So I think getting the idea out in front of, and if you're like young and scrappy and starting out, it's like any eyeballs you can get, whether it's on forums, social media, whatever. And then kind of being brutal with it and seeing like, okay, does this have, I sometimes get a little bit of flack because I have a lot of games that I have put out like a beta version for, and then it doesn't progress because the idea might have been okay, but it wasn't really great, or there might have been enough there for like playing a couple of games, but it was not enough to hang like a 100-page book that you could get 100 games out of. And that doesn't mean like every idea doesn't have to be like that. Like the RPG folks have done a lot of, they'll put out like a 5-page RPG that is about one super specific thing. It's about, being a vampire in 1789 in northern France. And that idea could hold up 5 pages of game, and that's all it needed to do. You play it once and post about it on your blog. But that's not stuff I'm usually interested in. I like to do things that are a little more, that just have a little more like weight to them, have a little more like engagement possible for the player. So you have to just kind of let some of those ideas like go and let them die. Sometimes sitting on it a little bit you get it out and you can just kind of forget about it. I think a lot of creative people have this, where like if you think of something and then you don't have a chance to like put it into practice, it'll just kind of like burn up your head. Like it'll keep sitting there and you keep thinking about it and you keep thinking about it. So eventually you just have to like put it out there and do something with it. I have so many things that don't make it past like my notebooks. I keep notebooks everywhere. I'll just scribble on them. And I'll go back and look at stuff, and like more often than not, it just gets torn out and crumbled up. Like the idea was stupid, or it was derivative, or there was just no point in making it. There's this process, I think on the old blog, I called it the funnel, which is like out of like 10 ideas that you come up with and you write down in your notebook, there's one or two that are actually good. And those all get funneled in. And then you start like writing on it. You start writing out a few pages. You write like an introduction. You write out some mechanics. And a couple of them will fall by the wayside because you realize you were not really that into it. And at that point of the funnel, you've probably had 40 ideas to begin with, and you're down to a couple now. And you start really doing the work, and you run into what I call the suck. And the suck is whatever part of the job you hate doing. So it is often proofreading. For me, it's writing terrain rules. I hate doing that. But any project you work on, if you're a programmer or if you're a graphic artist, everyone has that thing that you hate. And if your project is going to fail, that is where it happens. That's the suck. And that can weed out a game that you're just not like committed to, because like 50% of developing it is the fun part, and the other 50 is either just dull, like busy work, or just like a grind of getting it to the finish line. So the sooner you can get like feedback and eyeballs in that process, the better. You just have to, like I said, kind of filter through that. Both that you know what kind of feedback you're looking for without trying to be like beholden to the answer. Like, because it's easy to say like, okay, I really want to do X. So if I get feedback that is X is a bad idea, you should do Y instead. You have to kind of weight that is that bad feedback because it's not really answering your question, or is it because you're too wedded to the idea of doing X, even though people are telling you that is really not all that great. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, so one idea that did get written down on the notepad and did make it all the way through the funnel is this shared universe, this Unity universe that you've created. Now, here at Any Wargame Anytime, we're big fans of lore. Especially lore that's shared between games. So can you tell us a bit about Unity and kind of the inspiration for it and where you might take it in the future?
Yeah. So originally it was kind of a thought experiment. And I've been pretty open with where like my inspirations come from. I'll kind of talk about some specific things because people usually like the sort of deep dives of where did this particular thing come from. A lot of it was really a thought experiment of if there was the galactic empire that like every science fiction setting has to have by law. Like I think since 2013 that was like a legal requirement. Then what would that like actually look like? Because I wasn't really convinced. I wasn't trying to do like a super realistic setting, but I was like, I'm not super convinced that it would necessarily be like the Imperium of Man or like the dudes from Star Wars or whatever. But it probably would be kind of messy and chunky and weird because, like, you know, we can look, and I don't want to get into like politics or anything, but we can look at the difficulty of getting like 30 million people to all like do something efficiently. That is pretty difficult. It is really difficult when there's 350 million of the United States. So if you're trying to administer like a galaxy or a chunk of a galaxy, it would be bananas. So a lot of, especially the really early stuff, was kind of like laced with humor. That like the galactic administration would be this impenetrable bureaucracy that is just impossible for anyone to deal with, because that's the only thing it could be to run the galaxy. And so you would have all these groups and people and authorized agents and hired guns that would pop up around the edges of that system to essentially like get everything done. So if there's like an invasion force, the idea was that if whoever is the Unity administrator in that area, they see an alien invasion, it would take years for them to get the approval to have an army sent out to find out if there is an invasion so that they could deploy the fleet. Or they can go hire a bunch of goons with guns and for impulse control, and they can send them out to go fight the aliens, and it'll probably work out.
Yeah.
So that was
Shadow. That's great. That's
kind of like Shadowrun on a galactic level, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and then from there, it just kind of started. The way these things go, that when you start sitting and thinking about it, the pieces all kind of start coming in. So you start figuring out okay, so what does all these different things look like? And so some of the setting elements, some of them are intentional satire or something. It's no secret in a lot of the games that the view of galactic corporations is not super great. There's plenty of galactic mercenaries, corporate security troopers you end up fighting. Some things are just because I like them. I was always fascinated by the idea, how games, when I was growing up, always had a homage to something else. Warhammer used to be full of this stuff, where there's throwbacks and nods to different things. So I wanted to do some of that myself, but in ways that were to stuff I was interested in. So, the third edition 5 Parsecs books has a character in there that's a Doctor Who reference, because why not? I could get away with it. A lot of the alien races have more than a passing familiarity to Mass Effect, because I was really taken with that when those came out. So some of the things are like that, and some are just logical developments of the next thing. I knew pretty early on, because there were a lot of miniatures on the market that were cat people or animal people or things like that. And I always thought those were cool, because a lot of the role-playing games I played when I was younger, coming out of Sweden, had characters like that. So it was just always a thing. But I always thought it sounded kind of hokey to have. We wouldn't really see cat people evolving naturally. That seems dumb, even for a made-up world. So it's okay, well, in that case, they must be the result of genetic modification. Well, in that case, if you can genetically engineer fully reproducing cat people, you have, basically space wizard levels of genetic engineering. So in that case, if that's the case, what kind of things follow in the setting from that? If they have that level of genetic engineering, then X, Y, and Z must also be the case. So some of it is just kind of working through the thought process. Once you kind of set an element down, then a bunch of other things can suddenly be answered. You know what I mean? So a lot of the inspirations were it's kind of funny because I've played a lot of games in my life, but I honestly never played that many sci-fi miniatures games. We had a collection of games we played a lot. So a lot of them are, kind of mundane. We started with Warhammer 40K like everybody else. We played a lot of Warzone from Target Games. I played a lot of 5150. But that was kind of Stargrunt 2, although that didn't influence 5 Parsecs all that much. A lot of the influence was early, especially 16-bit era video games and computer games, which is sort of that's the next generation of influences. Because if you look at interviews with Rick Priestley and stuff, people like that, their influences were all rooted in when they were growing up. So there's a lot of growing up in Margaret Thatcher's England. There's a lot of 2000 AD and stuff like that, Dune and Star Wars, and or every fantasy writer, fantasy RPG writer, they all have the same influences, Conan and Elric and all that stuff.
There's these things that are on a cycle that kind of repeats in culture. And you and that actually goes back thousands of years. If you these kind of repeated trends that come back into popularity, it's an interesting field of some interesting rabbit hole you can go down if you want to look at that.
Yeah, for sure. But one of the things was a lot of those things, just because I grew up in Denmark, it was often harder to find things like that. So a lot of American pop culture, I just kind of missed out on until I was older. I didn't play Traveler until I was an adult. And some of those things could be very influential, but the stuff that really stuck with me a lot of times then were things like video games that we did have pretty ready access to, because everyone had that one friend who could get pirated games. So there's a lot of Quake 2 is a big influence. There's a lot of like Mass Effect, which is later, older games like Hired Guns and Alien Breed. A lot of like European computer games that were influences, and a lot of those are just more like visual things or like little snippets of things that sort of snuck in. But I think that's part of why I think the setting has seemed to resonate with people, is that it's obviously like really derivative in a lot of ways because it was kind of meant to. If you're doing a sci-fi miniatures game and you don't have a minis line, you got to let people use the minis they can't actually buy. And that's a lot of like dudes in power armor and like space fantasy dudes. So you kind of have to lean that way a little bit. But I think having inspirations that are just slightly off the beaten path does help make it like stick out a little bit more. Like everyone responds to Firefly being on the list because everyone liked Firefly, and it's like the prototype for like space rogues do funny things or do adventures. But a lot less people note that Trigun, the animated show, was on the list as well, and I think influences the sort of vibe and style like as much as or even more as Firefly did. It's just less of a common reference, just
less well known. It's a bit more niche. Everyone knows Firefly.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. And Firefly is, like it's easier to like sit down and get into. So I get it. I'm not like berating people over it. But there's a lot of, and that's what makes it like so satisfying to do. I think is you can kind of pick out some of those things and bring them in a little bit, and you can kind of, like I said, do the same thing that like people like Rick Priestley or Gary Gygax or whatever did for when they were doing it. And they were pulling out the things from like 20 years before them. And, at some point in like 2050 or something, maybe somebody is going to reference like, they're going to reference things like The Expanse because that's huge right now, or like the Foundation TV show, or, like you said, it is a cycle that just, you get the things that leave a mark on you, then get to like propagate them back. And I think setting writing can be, at least for me, that's at least part of it, is this kind of conscious effort to like to build some of those things in and kind of contribute to like the canon of minis gaming, I suppose.
Cool. So I guess to finish this off, what's next? What have you got that you're working on that you're actually able to tell us about that's coming up?
Yeah, well, so this is where I get to indulge in a little bit of a crass commercialism.
Go on.
So the two Parsecs things that are happening is Tactics, which has already been, should be mostly through layout and editing. I haven't seen like final versions of that yet. 5 Parsecs Tactics is basically going to be the other, for one, it's going to be larger games. So squads of troops, tanks, all that good stuff, but set in the same setting and based off the same mechanics. But it's also going to be the other wing of narrative gaming. So 5 Parsecs From Home was, the sitting down and doing the pseudo RPG kind of campaign. And Tactics is the other wing of sitting down with a game master and playing a scenario or creating a scenario you're going to play through. So it's kind of a different take on the idea of having story in war games, but from the more active perspective. So I'm both nervous and excited how people respond to that. But I think it'll be really good. And then I'm working,
absolutely looking forward to it.
I hope so.
I've been waiting for you to make this game for quite some time.
In a lot of ways, it kind of feels like because I've done so much stuff that like was nodding towards that or trying to bite off that apple. So it was good to like get to sit down and do it. Then what I'm working on right now is, and I'm going to use the title we have right now, although it may change, which is Planetfall. And I think there's like an old RPG book that's called that, so it may have to change to something else, just to avoid like trouble. But the idea of Planetfall is that'll be more Parsecs-y, but it's basically going to be landing on a unexplored world, building up a colony with like different buildings and doing research and stuff. And well, there'll still be lots of fighting and shooting at. Because for various reasons, everyone on the planet or every life form on the planet wants to eat you. So, you still have to fight them. But so it'll be more exploration focused. It'll be taking some of those elements from 5 Leagues, where you get to like draw out a map and you get to build this world. You'll have like your colony that you're building up and developing. There'll be a few tweaks on mechanics. So there'll be things like some very similar character classes. You'll have like scouts, scientists, and troopers, and they each have like different kit, different abilities that you can use. You'll have to kind of choose who you send out to do a specific mission. And also run the risk of like characters being attacked who you didn't send out on missions. So it'll be super exciting. I'm really excited about it. If I can advertise just one thing, because I think this will be like super cool. One of the things you'll get to do is there'll be a random table to create like creatures you encounter. And they can have some pretty wild abilities, like ranging from just like critters that run at you and try to eat you to things that teleport around, shoot acid at you. Just going bananas with procedural generation of creatures. But here's where it gets really cool. Your encounter table, instead of like in Parsecs, I think we had 4 with like 12-ish entries on each. Your encounter table is a blank sheet with 10 entries on it. And the first time you roll for an encounter, you will generate a creature and you will put it on your encounter sheet. The next time you have an encounter, you will roll D100 on your encounter table. And if you roll a blank result, you generate a new creature. If you roll one you've already had, you're encountering that creature type again. So by the end of it, you will kind of have populated like your specific game world with a bunch of creatures that you hopefully hated fighting because made them as mean as possible. But they will be your creatures. And with 10 entries on there, it'll be hopefully like a really unique. So you might roll up a bunch of things and decide that they're all like lizards and frogs and amphibians. So you paint up all your monsters or creatures as those, but somebody else might have come up with a different, they want to make creatures that are like living crystals or something. So they got a bunch of cheap like plastic crystals they want to convert. So everyone will get these like hopefully really like unique worlds with their own creatures that statistically speaking, only you encountered. Obviously, there's limits to how much variety you can have in the end. Like, I'm not making No Man's Sky on paper, but so that's a really cool.
That does sound pretty cool.
So,
any timeline?
The document or the main text should be done by the end of the year, and then from there, other than next year, once it reaches the Overlord's hands, the process is kind of slow because it has to fit into, they have a release schedule. They have to have like this time slot for the layout, this time slot for the editing. So at some point next year, Tactics hopefully should be out this year. Cool. And then from there, we have plans going beyond that, but those are not set in stone, and I'm not sure if I can talk about them anyway. But there are long-term plans for sure.
Awesome. Well, Dan and Sam, do you have any last questions or comments for Ivan before we sign off?
No, it's been really great just to pick your mind from not just to learn about your work, but also just to get your perspective and your mentality about how how this goes on. It's really cool. Thank you so much.
It's a useful facet that I think players don't get to see very often, is what goes on kind of from the developer and the creator standpoint, which is, I think it's an interesting perspective for us to be able to explore at times.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I love talking about this stuff. And I think, like you said, it's often kind of mysterious and like hidden away. So anything you do to kind of peel back the cover a little bit and talk about like the craft of what goes into games. And that sounds kind of pretentious, but I hope you understand. Like, that's not the intent.
No, we've had a couple of game designers on, and it's very obvious talking to them that it is a craft that you're engaging in.
Mm-hmm. And it's a skill that you've developed too, right? I mean, it's not just I have these spontaneous ideas and and they're amazing. There's a lot of a lot of work.
A lot of discipline, as you called it. There's not just the fun work either. Yeah.
There's the suck. I'm gonna co-opt that term at some point too. That was a good one. Everybody's got to deal with the suck.
Yes.
Well,
that's my contribution to the culture.
Yeah, that's right. Well, on that note, I think we'll Sign off. We've been Bozz, Dan, and Sam of Any Wargame Anytime, joined by Ivan of Nordic Weasel Games. Thank you very much, Ivan, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we'll see you all next time. Any wargame, anytime. Going where the game is good.